Good morning and thanks for joining us. My name is Linda Rosenblum. I'm the Education Program Manager for the National Park Service, and I'm the moderator for this Presidential Primary Sources series. And we want to welcome Birchwood School District to our President Truman and Civil Rights program today. So at this time, I'm going to go through a couple of introductory slides so you guys can see who all is involved in this program. So go ahead and forward the slides for me. Here you'll see all the partners that are participating. The Internet 2 is our hosting partner, the National Park Service, the Presidential Library, the Sixth Floor Museum at Dooley Plaza, President Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C., and Magpie and Idaho Education Network are also helping us with our live stream and bridging for this event. So at this time, we're going to turn it over to Mark Adams at the Truman Library, who's going to be our presenter for today. And I'll put my microphone on mute and let Mark take over.
Thank you, Linda. I would just want to check that the school can hear me okay. Can you guys see me and hear me all right? I'm getting lots of waves and nods, so that's good. Before I get started too much, my topic today is going to be President Truman and civil rights. And before I give you any information, I've got some nice information to share with you. I wanted to let you know where we are. We're in Independence, Missouri, which is about 20 miles east of Kansas City, Missouri. We're in the home of President Truman at his Presidential Library and Museum. His house that he lived in after he got married is at about 4 blocks from here. And really, although Truman wasn't born here, he was born in Lamar, Missouri in 1884, he really considered Independence as his hometown. As Linda said, I'm Mark Adams. I'm the Education Director here, and it's my pleasure to do this type of program for the Presidential Primary Sources Project for the 3rd year. Before I get started, I wanted to find out from the students there in Wisconsin what you already know about President Truman, and particularly civil rights. And if you struggle on civil rights, maybe you can tell me some other things that you already know about President Truman. But maybe first of all, to open it back to the students, for you to let me know what you already know about President Truman and his civil rights program, and then I can start to fill in the details after that. So I'm going to turn it back to the students. Maybe one of you take the mic. Maybe you can go around the table. It looks like I can see half a dozen of you around the table there. And maybe share with me what you already know about Truman and civil rights, and then we can take it from there. So any volunteers? Don't be shy.
We don't really know anything about him.
Okay, that's fine. I appreciate your honesty. What about, don't mute it just yet. I'm going to have you talk a lot this morning. So, but okay, so you don't know much about him and his civil rights. What do you know about President Truman? Anything at all that you already know about President Truman? Just in general?
No.
Nothing at all. Really. Okay, well, we're going to start at basic. Well, that helps me out, so I don't feel like I'm repeating information you might have considered. I'm going to come back to you here in a few minutes and ask you some more questions. You can leave it muted. You're fine. I'm going to come back to you and show you some things on the PowerPoint, and then maybe see what information we can gain from you. And I'm going to share information as well. I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint. I'm going to check that you can see that. Hopefully all our technology works today. And we'll go from there. Okay, can you see that PowerPoint okay? Yes? I can see you waving, but now my picture of you now has gone really small. So I'm going to, if you could just unmute and just let me know if you can see that PowerPoint.
We can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is a photograph of President Truman as he's about to address the NAACP in 1947, and we're going to get to some of that information later on. I'm glad that you can see it and you can still hear me, so that's good. So we're trusting the technology is working, so that's a great thing. Here at the Truman Library, we're our presidential library, we're part of the National Archives. We have close to 16 million documents in our collection here at the Library and Archives, all housed in this building. We have about 100,000 museum objects in our museum collection, and a small portion of that is devoted to President Truman and his civil rights programs. So that's what I'm going to devote my time to talk to you about today. And just to kind of go to the end before I get into the background, one of the main things that Truman's responsible for as president is Executive Order 9981. And on the right of the slide, you can see the photograph of that document that was signed in July 26, 1948. And I've deliberately not put the information on there about what this executive order was responsible for, because on the next slide, I'm going to show you a close-up. Now, I know that might be difficult to read from where you are, but can anybody make out the title of the top of that executive order? There's 2.5 lines, all in all uppercase letters. Can anybody see from your end what that executive order was about?
Establishing the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in Armed Services.
Right, so this executive order Truman issued in July of 1948. Truman is establishing a committee to look at the equality and treatment opportunity of the armed services. So he's looking at the armed forces, all branches of the military, and establishing equal treatment for all. And then it ends up being a 2-page executive order where he establishes a committee to look into equality in the armed forces, and ultimately it leads to desegregation of the military. So you may be familiar with desegregation in the public schools in 1954, but 6 years earlier, Truman issues this executive order where we have integration of all branches of the military. So that's going to be one of the main focuses of what we're going to look at this morning. One of the things to consider, though, is that this was kind of a surprising decision by President Truman. He wasn't known really as an activist to favor African American issues at that time. He was born as a Southerner in Missouri in 1884. His family was very much on the southern side of the Civil War. Both sets of his grandparents owned slaves. His mother's family, the Young family, was actually imprisoned and interred by the Union Army, and they were moved from their home and forced to sign loyalty oaths to the Union Army, which didn't go over very well. And throughout his own life, Truman used racist language in letters, private letters to family and friends. So for him to do this executive order providing equality to all African Americans in the military was kind of a surprise. So one of the things I want to try and show you this morning is how that journey unfolds. How does he make that transition from being a Southerner and really not in favor of equality for African Americans to the point that he decides to integrate the armed forces and do some other civil rights measures as well by the time that he's president in 1948. So the background of Truman is important to understand this. You may or may not know then, if you didn't know much about President Truman and his background, earlier in his life, he was a soldier in World War I. He fought in France during that war. He trained in Oklahoma before going over to France in March of 1918. He was a captain, and you can see his identification card, which we have in our museum collection here. On the right side, you can see his name and his rank, the captain. And then after that, can you guys see the letters and the numbers after that on that identification card? Are you able to read that? Anybody able to see those letters and numbers?
Yep.
What do they say?
129 FA.
You got that perfectly. 129FA. So you have a primary source there. This is his identification card from World War I. I don't expect you to know that, but did anybody want to take a stab at what those letters and numbers might mean? Any military people in the room that might understand that?
Would it be his ranking or what they'd know him by?
Not quite, but that's a good guess. Any other thoughts? Any other ideas there?
No.
No.
Okay, so he's part of the 129th Field Artillery. So that was part of the unit that he was in. And if you can see the stamp at the top of the page, right to the left of his head in that photograph, you might be able to see 35th, and then you can see the letter D and maybe the letter V. And that's indicating that he's in the 35th Division. He was in charge of a battery that was known as Battery D, which made up of Irish Catholics from Kansas City. And at that time, he becomes very close friends for a lifelong friend, Eddie Jacobson from Kansas City, which becomes important later in his life. And then on the left, you can see him in his World War I uniform. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is that when he, as a war veteran himself, he becomes very sympathetic to World War II war veterans 20 or so years later. So he comes back from Paris, from France in 1919, gets married, and then has a career as a clothes salesman with his friend Eddie Jacobson, who he met during World War I. They open a clothes store. That goes bust in 1922. And at that point, he goes into politics, becomes a county commissioner in the county we're in, Jackson County, Missouri, where Independence is the county seat. And then by the 1930s, he becomes a United States Senator for Missouri for the next 10 years until he becomes vice president in 1944. And ultimately, in April of 1945, 70 years ago this year, he becomes president. So some of the questions I want your teacher and you to consider later on, not today. I consider this as a way to get started on looking at Truman and civil rights. Some of the questions for you to think about. And I can sure send this PowerPoint to your teacher after the presentation today to think about how did this executive order come about, and we're going to address some of those issues this morning. What reasons Truman had for actually issuing the order. The fact that 1948 was an election year, a presidential election, and Truman was running. Did that make any difference at all? The fact there was lots of public pressure, letter writing campaigns, people trying to sway him one way or the other about rights for African Americans after World War II. And did Truman truly convert to this issue? As some historians have argued that he converted and that he changed his mind from his earlier life and really believed in what he was doing to provide more equality for African American soldiers. So those are some of the issues you might consider as you start to study this in more detail. As you study civil rights in the 60s, I always encourage teachers and students to go back into the 1940s and 1950s to see what was happening before the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. This is in 1948. In 1947, a very famous baseball player, African-American baseball player, started playing in the major leagues just 1 year before. Does anybody know who that was? What baseball player integrated baseball?
Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson. So we've got all this going on at the same time. Very good. So the context is really important. You have baseball beginning its integration in 1947. And as we saw with that executive order in 1948, Truman integrates the military. So all of these things are beginning to happen. And what we're really looking at is why is that? Why is this beginning to change? So some of the things historians have looked at different ways that Truman made his decision, or any president makes their decision. And you can look at these 6 or 7 areas for any president, looking at any decision they make. Do they do it under principle? Do they do it because of circumstances that are demanding some action? Do they do it out of sense of morality, or is it because of politics and it's an election year? Or the pressure from other countries? Does it contradict foreign policy? Or is it because of public pressure? Or in fact, is it a combination of those things? So every presidential decision that's made by any president, you can look at these 6 or 7 areas, and there may be other issues as well, to measure them to say, why is a president acting this way? Why are they doing this at this time? Why are they making that decision? And so historians have looked at Truman and looking at that contradiction in his background and looking at his actions to try and figure out what is it that led him to make this decision. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's a question of interpretation. And to do that, we look at some of the documents, and we're going to do that here in a moment. Just to give you some background, World War II ends in 1945. Truman becomes president on April 12th, 1945, because FDR dies, and Truman is vice president. He's only vice president for 82 days. He only meets Franklin Roosevelt twice during that time, so he's not very well prepared. On May 8th, just 3 weeks after he becomes president, Germany surrenders. So there's victory in Europe, what we know as VE Day, takes place May 8th, 1945. That just happens to be President Truman's birthday. His 61st birthday is the same day, May 8th. So looking at America at that time, population in 1940 is 131 million. You had 12.6 million African Americans, about 10% of the population. The Army itself during World War II had become the nation's largest minority employer, and almost 1 million veterans were African Americans, 880,000. And about 1 million had been inducted into the armed forces through the draft through 1945. Some other information about World War II. Although there were lots of soldiers and people African Americans in the branches of the military, very few of them were officers. There was a 10% ceiling, a quota, so to speak, that was put in place that was very restrictive. But when soldiers and those white soldiers that served, when they were surveyed about the quality of work done by African American soldiers, 80% said they performed very well in combat. So hang on one second. So although we see a photograph there of integrated troops, just to drive the point home, during World War II, United States troops were segregated during World War II. A lot of people don't realize that. Although we have this photograph of integrated forces, on the ground, in action, those troops were segregated. You can see them. The soldiers there have captured a Nazi flag at the end of the war. They did not fight to get in integrated troops. So they were fighting against racism. They were fighting against Nazism. But the troops were segregated. So that contradiction comes into play when those soldiers start to come home. So I want to point out to you one incident that really some historians have argued have changed Truman's mind. There's a couple of different incidents I want to make you aware of. So in 1946, you see a photograph on the right of the slide of Isaac Woodard, an African-American soldier who received medals in World War II. When he's returning home in South Carolina, he asks the bus driver to stop so he can go to the restroom. The bus driver is rather disgruntled. The mayor and the city marshal are right there in Batesburg, South Carolina. They think that Isaac Woodard backtalks them, and they start to beat him and take him to jail and imprison him. While he's in the prison, the city marshal gouges his eyes out with a billy club, and Isaac Woodard is left blind for the rest of his life. So a horrific incident that causes uproar. So this war veteran from World War II is treated this way, not just by the general public, but by the authorities, by the mayor and the city marshal in South Carolina. Another incident that got Truman's attention in July in Monroe, Georgia. 2 veterans and their wives were dragged from a vehicle, tied to a tree and shot down. And one of the women was discovered was 7 months pregnant. So how does Truman react to that? This is a quote from a letter that he gave to Democrats who were complaining about his civil rights. And there's a number of these incidents. I just gave you 2 examples where he says, "My very stomach turned over when I learned that Negro soldiers just back from overseas were being dumped out of army trucks and beaten. Whatever my inclination as a native of Missouri might have been, as president, I know this is bad. I shall fight to end evils like this." So with that quote, with that primary source in front of you, I'm going to turn it over back to you to ask you a couple of questions about this quote. So Truman there in that quote, what does that tell you what does that quote tell you about President Truman that he said in his reaction to some of these incidents? Any information you can glean from this quote? I'm going to turn it back to you to respond. What does that tell you about Truman?
It tells us that he's against racism.
It's against racism. What does he say there in that second paragraph? What does he acknowledge in that second paragraph?
It kind of cuts it off a little on our TV, so we kind of can't see it a bit.
Okay, let me read that second paragraph to you then. It says, "Whatever my inclination as a native of Missouri might have been, as president, I know this is bad. I shall fight to end evils like this."
He's fighting for what he believes.
Wasn't
Fighting
Missouri
for
on
what
the
he believes.
south side?
Say that last part again.
Wasn't Missouri on the south side? So even though the South was for racism, he's from the South. As a president, he knows it's bad. So even though he's on the bad side, he's fighting against them.
That's very good. So he's acknowledging the fact that he is from Missouri, what his inclinations as a native Missourian, but he knows in his role as president that this is bad. So he's kind of separating out, here's my personal life, here's where I'm from, here's my roots, but as president, I have to do something about it. Great answers. I'm going to continue on. So just this idea that he does separate, and he does this with other decisions as he's president. He puts aside his own personal background, and as president, he knows he needs to act in the greater interests of the country. So one of the things he does, just to back up, that Isaac Woodard, who was beaten and blinded, the policeman that did that was put on trial. The trial lasted 30 minutes and he was acquitted. He was found not guilty. So Truman was even more outraged because the jury was all of his Southern peers and they decided nothing was wrong. So with that in mind, that didn't happen until October. So when that came down, Truman was outraged. And so he issues an executive order 2 years earlier than the integration of the military to establish a committee on civil rights, the first time that's ever been done in the United States history, to strengthen and protect the civil rights of the American people. And a year later, you can see the cover of that report called To Secure These Rights, where they talk about the types of things that need to be done to strengthen the civil rights of the American people. So there's some background here as they start to investigate what is going on. As I showed you the photograph on the very first slide, Truman became the first president to speak to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And his quote there that's kind of often quoted from this, and you can see the photograph from his address to the NAACP, "It's my deep conviction we've reached a turning point in our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens. It's more important today than ever to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights." So this was a speech that went nationally across the whole country about a year and a half before the presidential election. So he's really setting out his tone and what he now believes in, quite different than his earlier life. So this is I'm not going to tell you where this is from right away. Can you see this one paragraph on your screen clearly?
Most of it.
Most of it.
little
Okay.
bit.
Okay. So I want you to read this. I'll explain where it's from in a little while. But I want you to read this. It's got a number 6. It says civil rights. Read what you can, and I'll read it to you as well, so I can read the parts that maybe are cut off at the bottom. It's just 6 or 7 lines. And then we're going to talk about this document. So be ready to weigh in on what you think this is and where it came from. But I'm going to read it to you first, just because of the nature of the technology. The Republicans know how vulnerable the Democratic Party is insofar as the Negro vote is concerned. They have been bending every effort to woo the Negroes away from the administration's fold. In all probability, Republican strategy at the next session will be to offer an FEPC, that's Fair Employment Practices Commission, an anti-poll tax bill, and an anti-lynching bill. This will be accompanied by a flourish of oratory devoted to the civil rights of various groups of our citizens. So with that in mind, what do you think this document is? Who do you think has written it? Who do you think it's aimed at? Any guesses? And there are no wrong answers here, just to speculate.
Is it the Congress?
Not necessarily the Congress. Any other ideas?
The Southerns?
Which party do you think, would you think the Republicans or the Democrats wrote this?
The Republicans.
Okay, so read the first two sentences. The Republicans know how vulnerable the Democratic Party is insofar as the Negro vote is concerned. They have been bending every effort to woo the Negroes away from the administration's fold. Those two sentences should help you identify who wrote this.
So the Democrats?
Yeah, the Democrats. Why do you think that?
It was just a wild guess.
It's a wild guess.
Scotty?
Because it's like stating the Republicans, not like the Democrats. Or it's telling the Republicans in a way, I guess.
So the first part says the Republicans know how vulnerable the Democratic Party is. And then it says they have been bending. So when they say they, who are they referring to?
Is it the Republicans?
Yeah, they're referring to the Republicans. So this is written by the Democrats. And this is actually written, you guys did a great job there. This is actually written by some of Truman's aides about a year before the 1948 election. So it's written in November of 1947. And it actually is part of a 43-page memo of their election strategy. What the Democrats need to do to win the 48 election a year later. So they're laying out, here's what we need to do to win the election. So let me show you another part of this. This is just a very small extract from this 43-page memo. But there are two pieces in it that refer to civil rights. So when it says the administration, it's talking about the Truman administration. So on this one, it says the administration would make a grave error if we permitted the Republicans to get away with this. It would appear to be a sound strategy to have the president go as far as he feels possible could go in recommending measures to protect the rights of minority groups. This course of action would obviously cause difficulty with our Southern friends, but that is the lesser of two evils. Okay, so what information can you gain from this second extract? What are the Democrats telling Truman and the administration to do? Look at that second sentence.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does he mean by the two evils? Is he meaning like a war or something, or?
Well, what the course of action, it says, would obviously cause difficulty with our Southern friends, but that is lesser of the two evils. So the two evils are, do we try and take this issue away from the Republicans and claim it for ourselves? And the second evil is, we're going to lose the Southern friends. We're going to lose the Southern Democrats. If we promote a civil rights package, we're going to lose those in the South that have previously voted for the Democrats. So one evil is the Republicans are going to take this issue and run with it instead of us, instead of the Democrats. If we do that, then we're going to lose the South. So the two choices are, do we take this issue away from the Republicans, or do we let them have it, or do we lose the South? And so they're saying we're prepared to lose the South to win the general election. So that second sentence, it says, it would appear to be sound strategy to have the president go as far as he feels possible could go in recommending measures to protect the rights of minority groups. So what strategy are they telling the president to follow?
Go as far as he feels possible to protect the rights of minority.
Yeah, so that last part of the sentence, recommending measures to protect the rights of minority groups. So they're telling the president this would be a good election strategy. So some of the critics of Truman have said, well, this memo points out that this is all an election strategy. It's not whether you believe it. It's not whether you have all these moral concerns about people being beaten up, veterans. But this election memorandum saying this is a strategy. There's no morality here. There's no principles. It's all to win the election. And historians debate these things by finding these pieces from recommendations that were made to Truman. There's no real response from Truman, so we don't know what Truman thought about it, but people have pointed to that. So I'm not going to go through all of these points, but that election memo covered many, many things. They predicted who the Republican candidate would be. They said that Truman must move to the left, that machine politics was over and they should be more aware of pressure groups. They should try and court the vote of farmers, labor, progressive, and racial groups to win New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and so on and so on. Amazingly, this 43-page memo comes out to be true. Many of these things come to pass. So it's just more ammunition for critics of Truman to say that the only reason he did this civil rights program was to try and win the 1948 election. Okay. Now, I know this one's a little bit small, but are you able to read this extract?
Yeah.
Okay, this is from Truman's Memoirs in 1956. So this is 3 years after his presidency is over. And really what I wanted to point at is the last paragraph. Are you able to read the last paragraph? You said earlier the bottom part of this was cut off.
We can read the last paragraph.
Oh, good. So take a look at that last paragraph. This is where Truman's remembering his presidency and various pieces of it. It's a 2-volume book, but this is just one page of that. The last paragraph says, I felt also that any other course would be inconsistent with international commitments and obligations. We could not endorse a color line at home and still expect to influence the immense masses that make up the Asian and the African peoples. It was necessary to practice what we preached, and I tried to see that we did it. So, in that paragraph, what is Truman saying his motivation was to follow a civil rights program? What is his reasoning for following a civil rights program there in those 3 sentences? Anybody?
Is it meaning a little bit more global?
More global. And what does he say is inconsistent?
The
International.
Yeah.
So thinking about the end of World War II, as I mentioned before, they've been fighting the Nazis and their racist policies against Jews and others in Europe. And then to come home, then you have segregated people. So it was inconsistent. So he says in that line, we could not endorse a color line at home, meaning segregation, and still expect to influence the immense masses that make up the Asian and African people. So it's inconsistent. You can't tell the rest of the world to practice democracy if you're not practicing it at home. So that was what Truman pointed to as being one of his reasonings for his civil rights program. So just some other factors to consider if you take this a little bit further. The American leaders were criticized by the Soviet Union. By this point, the Cold War has begun between the US and the Soviet Union. And so when the United States criticized the Soviet army for being in Eastern Europe, for being in East Germany, for being in Poland, for being in other parts of Europe that the US didn't think they should be, and for not practicing democracy, the Soviets pointed right back at the US and said, look at your segregation policies. Look at the lack of freedoms African Americans have. Allies complained, the British, the French, they complained to the United States about the contradiction in this message between democracy and communism. The Cold War was a war of ideology. So if you're criticizing communism for not being about freedom, then you need more freedom at home. And so Truman did admit that it was inconsistent with international commitments, and the quote we just saw from his memoirs, we could not endorse a color line at home and still expect to influence people in other countries. So there are other factors there to consider as we look at why Truman did what he did in civil rights. I was going to have you look at these letters, but in retrospect, I think some of these are too small. But as I mentioned, I'm going to send these to your teacher so you can see these in more detail in your classroom. And I would encourage you to analyze these letters. I've got 3 or 4 of them that I'm going to skip through here pretty quickly to see what people are saying, the public pressure that I mentioned at the beginning. So this letter is from the Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service and Training, where the African American community are threatening not to enroll young African Americans in the draft. And you can see another example of some of these. This one is on the opposite of opinion. This is a member of the Army that was questioning why transportation across state lines on the railroads was integrated when he felt like that violated states' rights. So that was somebody who was pro-segregation. And then we have more letters agreeing with Truman, commending him for his civil rights report and wanting him to abolish to abolish segregation immediately. So you see letters from all different places, for and against. The White House was deluged with letters from all over the country, particularly after the incidents that I mentioned earlier with the beating of African American soldiers and killing of African American soldiers after World War II. When that became public, the rate of letters increased dramatically as that became national news. And so some of the things that led up to the Truman's desegregation order, the Committee Against Jim Crow, I just showed you a letter of. They said that African Americans refused to serve in the armed forces in the future if segregation was not outlawed. And they started to have nonviolent civil protests. As I mentioned, there were many letters. Children got involved in the campaign, and thousands of letters were sent to Truman between 1946 and 1948 on both sides, not just on one side. So clearly something needed to be done. So that public pressure became another factor that historians point to, that Truman needed to do something, that he couldn't just leave the issue alone. So some people have asked, why couldn't he done it a different way? Why an executive order? Just to give you some background on that, I mentioned the report, Secure These Rights. All of the legislation proposals that secure these rights proposed, all of them were blocked in the Senate by Southern senators, and those are Democrats primarily, and Republicans. So everything they tried to pass through legislation was blocked by Congress. Does that sound familiar? We have a Congress that did not want to act on Truman's civil rights program. In February of 1948, Truman did a speech, a joint session of Congress, that he made a speech on February the 2nd, 1948, where he outlined his civil rights plan. 82% of the people polled in a Gallup poll were against Truman's civil rights message. 82%. Now, I want you to think about the 21st century. If you've ever thought about a president proposing something that 82% of the population were against in an election year, wouldn't happen. So those that point towards this being an election strategy have to remember that 82% of the general population were against Truman's civil rights message that he proposed in February of 1948. So the executive order was something he could do without opposition from Congress. He could sign a piece of paper and it became law. So in July of 48, he signed the executive order that I showed you at the beginning, desegregating the military. And on the same day, Executive Order 9980, which ended discrimination in the federal government. So federal employees also were integrated and did not face race-based employment. So you couldn't deny somebody employment in the federal government if they were African American. So it's just some examples and things for your teachers to think about. And you said you're a project-based classroom, so maybe projects that you might want to take on individually. Looking at why did Truman take this action, those headings that I mentioned before. Why did he do this? Principle, circumstances, morality, politics, an election year, pressure from other countries, that idea that it contradicted with foreign policy, or was it public opinion? So you could all investigate those and then argue them, debate those issues. You could look at other presidential decisions and use those same 6 headings. Or if you were president, after looking at some of the documents, what would you have done if you were president? Looking at those letters that I shared with you, choose one of those letters and write a reply based on those. If you were president, how would you respond to one of these letters that came in, either for the issue or against the issue? So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you. I'm going to get myself back on the screen. Give me 1 second. I'm not the best with the technology. Can you see me again? And the PowerPoint should be over. All right. Yep. So any questions or thoughts or comments that you have? I know we have a tight time frame here, but I wanted to make sure you have a chance to give me some feedback. Any questions or comments?
Did he truly convert?
Well, that's the debate. I mean, that's the thing about history, is I could say he did, but then I could bring somebody else in the room and they could say he did not. I do think that the attacks on the African American soldiers truly made an impact. I don't know if anybody can fully convert, but they did make an impact. Just as an aside, in the 1960s, he didn't die until 1972. In the 1960s, when Martin Luther King was pushing the civil rights programs, he very much opposed what Martin Luther King was trying to do. So he converted some, I would say, but I don't think he went the whole way. How's that for a political answer? Next question.
Good.
What time did he die?
He died at 8 o'clock in the evening on December the 26th, 1972, the day after Christmas. So he was 88 years old. He's buried here in our building in a courtyard. We have a courtyard in the center of our building. So directly behind me, we have a screen behind me right now, but if I was to walk 50 feet behind me, out of the doors behind me, President Truman is buried here and Mrs. Truman is buried here.
Oh.
Another question.
What's his real wife's name?
His wife's name is Elizabeth Wallace Truman, and she's known as Bess Wallace Truman. Wallace was her maiden name. So although her name was Elizabeth, she was more often known as Bess. And on our website, trumanlibrary.org, we have almost 1,400 letters that President Truman wrote to Bess Wallace over the course of about 40 years. So you can see all of those online. Yes?
How did he die?
Just of old age. He'd had a fall in 1967, and then about 5 years later, he died at age 88. Just some pneumonia and then some old age. Other questions? Any questions about the civil rights program or other things that he did as president? Okay, I've got a go ahead.
When you say convert, what do you mean?
Well, just that early in his life, he used very racist language in his letters and in his speeches and things. So then later, as president, he does this executive order to integrate the military, which seems to be very forward-thinking and progressive. So how did he come to that? Did he convert his thinking? Did he just do this for political means? So just to think about why did he make this decision, Did he really, you've probably had opinions about somebody or about an issue, and then you might have changed your mind later. So why did you change your mind? What led to that? Did you become more educated? Did something happen that maybe changed your mind? Yeah, next question.
Could it be debatable of whether or not he was for racism or not for racism?
Absolutely, it could be debated. Absolutely, yeah. So you could really structure that in your classroom. You could have some people take one issue, some people take the other. Look at the documents. We have a lot of documents on our website. We have a special section on Truman's desegregating the military. You can see on our website lots and lots of documents that talk about those issues. Yep. So you could certainly debate it. Some historians would say, yes, he converted, and some would not. I was going to recommend one book, and then I'll take another question. You probably can't see the book, but this is a book that was written just a couple of years ago by John Taylor. He's a professor here in Missouri, and the name of the book is Freedom to Serve. And it's a great book because it has the documents in the book. So you can see some of the letters and some of the documents. The book itself is only about 175 pages, so it's not too long, quite thin. And the back of the book are lots of the documents that really reference his decision. And there's a companion website to go with the book, so you can see all of the documents online as well. So it's Freedom to Serve by John Taylor, and John is spelled Jon, so John without an H. And I would highly recommend this for high school students that are looking at civil rights in the 1940s. It's a great book. Question?
Yes, I have two. If one of us were able to do a project on this, could we consider you as a live resource? And for the book, could we also, do you know where we could find the book at a library or something?
The book I know is available on Amazon. So if you wanted to purchase it for your school library or something, you can get it from Amazon.com. I would certainly be a resource for you. So once you did some investigation and research and you wanted to interview me about the issues, we could set up another call like this, and I could certainly answer any questions or give you some additional insight whenever you might need, whenever you want to set that up. We can do that after you've done some investigation of yourselves. Yep. So that's an open invitation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I've got one question for you. Did you enjoy it?
Yes.
It was really interesting.
Good, because you guys did a great job with your question, considering you didn't know much beforehand. You did a really good job with your questions, and I can tell that you're really interested in what we're talking about, and I appreciate your time and questions this morning.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I think that if there's no final questions, I think we can conclude the call. All right, thank you.
Mike, do you have any?
Bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for joining us today. We have our next event in this series coming up on February 18th, and that will be with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library. And the topic on the February 18th event is the Roosevelts and race in the 1930s and 40s. Brought to you by the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library, and we hope you will sign up and participate in that event and some of the other future events that we have in our series this year. So with that, we'll end the call and say thank you. Bye-bye.